Welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome. This is the first session of What Makes Halachic Loopholes Religious with Dr. Elana Stein Hain, I believe. Is that how you pronounce it? I apologize.
Elana Stein, Hain. No worries.
Hain. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. This is a three class session. And the class is about how people make fun of legal loopholings all the time, especially during tax season. But what about halachic loopholes? In advance of Pesach, we will look at the DNA of halachic loopholing in Talmudic sources, what justifies it and what doesn't, with an attempt to understand how legal circumvention and legal integrity went hand in hand for Chazal. This three-session course is based on the instructor's book, Circumventing the Law, Rabbinic Perspectives on Loopholes and Legal Integrity. Dr. Elana Stein is the Rosh Bet Midrash and Senior Fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute. She formerly served as clergy at both Lincoln Square Synagogue and the Jewish Center. She authored, again, I'll mention the book, Circumventing the Law, Rabbinic Perspective on Loopholes and Legal Integrity. And she also hosts the bi-weekly podcast, Texting, which brings Torah into conversation with the issues of today. She currently lives in Jerusalem this year with her family. And with that, I'll turn it to you, Dr. Hain.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. So here's what we're going to try to do over the next three sessions. Session one, we're going to try to get at the logic that the rabbis, and when I say the rabbis here, I mean 3rd century to 7th century, Chazal, I would call them, Chachamenu Zichronam Livracha, our sages of blessed memory, what they thought the logic was in loopholing, right? That's what I want to do in session one. In session two, what I want to do is I want to look at how their own parameters for when loopholes are allowed and how they should be done end up evolving. They're not necessarily the same from the 3rd century to the 5th century. They're not necessarily the same in Eretz Yisrael as they are in Bavel. And I think that's important to see as well. And then in the 3rd session, I want to take on, and maybe we'll do a poll as to which one people want to look at. I want to take on one of the more famous legal loopholes, because the truth is when we talk about legal loopholes over the next 2 weeks, we're really looking at the DNA of the loopholing phenomenon, rather than saying, oh, let's look at a famous one like selling your chametz. Let's look at a famous one like Eruv. Let's look at a famous one like canceling debts or not canceling debts, as the case may be, at the end of the Shemitah year. So we're not going to be doing that in the first 2 weeks. What we're going to be doing is giving some logic behind those. But I think in the 3rd week, what we'll do is we will take on actually one of those big loopholes, okay? And probably, because we're around Pesach, it'll probably be selling your chametz, okay? So let's start with I know that people received a source sheet. What I want to start with is I want to start with an image. And I'm going to share my screen. And I want you to look at these. It's really 3 images, right? We have 3 images, I think, that one can use and think about when you're going to come up with how do I think about legal loopholes in general. And you may choose, by the way, one image for secular legal loopholes, and you may choose a different image for religious legal loopholes, right? That's totally possible. When you look at these 3 images, I want you to notice when you look at the image on the left essentially makes it look like the whole raison d'etre of loopholing is to get out of something, to get around something. It doesn't really seem to have necessarily an affirmative goal. It has sort of an avoidance kind of goal. If you look at the right side, I used, like, in a very literal way, the idea of a loophole, as in like a loop and a hole that is created by looping rope around itself. And you notice that these loops together actually make a heart, which indicates that maybe sometimes you use loopholing in order to maintain the legal system as a whole, in order to maintain the heart of the system. And then in the middle, I put a question mark made from a loophole, right? And I think that when we look at the way that Chazal thought about it, right? That the rabbis in the 3rd to 7th centuries thought about it. We see that the middle image is actually the most powerful image. And by the way, what I'm going to try to do here is I'll probably stop either at a midway point to take questions or comments, and then again at the end, because the nice thing about having a small group of people is that we can actually interact to the degree that people want to. So it seems to me that Chazal, even in the term that they choose to use for legal loopholing, they've chosen a word that has this kind of dual dimensionality to it. Of to an extent, it's good and wise and maintains the system, but to another degree, it may also be something that's just evasive. And the term that they use is ha'arama. Hey, ayin, resh, mem, hey. Now you might be thinking to yourself, I want you to visualize this word, ha'arama. The first thing that people usually think of when they think biblically about this is they think about the snake in Gan Eden. The snake in Gan Eden is arum mikol chayat hasadeh, more cunning than any other animal. So you think of that as a negative, right? So why would they choose to use the word ha'arama if it's negative in its connotation? But then you look at the book of Mishlei, the book of Proverbs, where it is unmistakable. About a dozen times, the book of Proverbs talks about orma, same term, as something not neutral, not okay sometimes, but positive every single time. And in fact, it seems to mean not cunning in a bad way, but it seems to mean prudence or common sense or street smarts. So even the opening of the book of Mishlei, Proverbs, Mishlei Shlomo ben David Melech Yisrael, here's the book. What's the purpose? Ladat chokhmah umusar lahavin imrei vina, in order to know wisdom, to know instruction, or maybe discipline, to understand understanding. What else would you do with understanding, right? Lakachat musar haskel tzedek umishpat umisharim, to really be able to receive some sort of common sense discipline, to understand what's just and what's right and what's fair. And look at this, latet lafitaim orma. The purpose of the book is to give the petty, the simple person, the gullible person, orma, a little bit of prudence, wisdom, street smarts. Lanar, and to the young person, da'at umizima, some discerning knowledge and discretion. And so when I see that Chazal chose the word ha'arama, what I'm realizing is, holy cow, they choose that word because it has both Solomonic, Mishlei, and Serpentine, the Garden of Eden, ways of thinking about them. It's not a question of, is a loophole good or bad? It's a question of what makes a given loophole in a given situation good or bad. Hence the question mark. Sometimes they specifically advocate for a loophole because it will maintain the heart of something important, while other times they are less sanguine about it. And in fact, it's interesting, there's a parallel between secular legal discussion of loopholes and Chazal's discussion of loopholes. In secular legal discussions of loopholes, we talk about two categories. Avoidance, completely legal. I'm sending my tax documents to my accountant. And I'm asking my accountant, tell me what I can do to ensure that I am the most efficient with paying my taxes this year. I don't want to pay too much. I want to pay what I have to pay. That doesn't mean that he's not going to tell me, oh, you should put some money in your kid's 509, I think, right? Whatever that, you can see I'm very good at this, right? The college fund, you should put some money in there because that's a tax shelter and it's good. The money will grow tax-free. Is he doing something illegal? Absolutely not. That's called avoidance. That's on the 529. Thank you, Lauren Deutsch, right? That's called avoidance. On the other side, there's things that are illegal. Evasion, Tax evasion is highly problematic. I would also add asur, right? It is prohibited. And that Chazal also have those. Sometimes they'll say a ha'arama, we want you to go and do it, or we at least tolerate it. And other times they'll say absolutely not. There's a third category that's not an official category, but I just love it because I think it captures something important. What if you have a loophole where you're sort of like, I don't know, reasonable people can disagree. Some people might say, yeah, that totally seems fine to me. Somebody else might say, not so fine to me. So there actually was a term coined called avoision, which to me sounds like a Yiddish word, if you ask me. But avoision is kind of like is it evasion or is it avoidance? I don't know. Reasonable people are going to disagree. So Chazal have that too. They have places where it's not unanimously go for it or we tolerate it. And it's not unanimously don't do that. It's some machloket. And the truth is, where you find the arguments as to yes or no in particular situations, that's actually where you're going to get the most bang for your buck in trying to figure out, okay, what makes a loophole good? What makes a loophole bad? Right? So that's where we're going to end up going today in order to try to understand what might make a loophole religious and what might make a loophole irreligious. There's one thing I want to point out to you, though, before we jump into that question of what makes a loophole religious, what makes a loophole irreligious, is I want to contrast the way that Chazal think with the way that essentially the Greeks and the Romans presented this whole issue of loopholing. Because the truth is, we did not come up with the term for loopholes first. Within a century before the Mishnah and the Tosefta, the rabbinic companion to the Mishnah, meaning they're written around the same time, or I should say, edited, anthologized around the same time, before they came up with ha'arama or leha'arim, the Romans had a term called fraus legi, legal fraud. That's what they called loopholing. Now, compare the two. Using ha'arama, you have the positive of Mishle of Proverbs, and you have the negative of the Garden of Eden. But when you say something's legal fraud, fraus legi, there's only one connotation, which is it's bad news. And that actually goes back a long way. Just because it was introduced, it seems, in the 2nd century, doesn't mean that it doesn't have like actually a very deep roots in Greco-Roman thought. And I want to give you an example of something that's happening hundreds of years earlier. Take a look at this from Cicero, the statesman. Injustice often arises also through chicanery, meaning through trickery, that is through an over-subtle and even fraudulent construction of the law. This it is, that gave rise to the now familiar saying, more law, less justice. That's all you need to hear. More law, less justice. Chazal do not think that. They do not think the more formally you look at the law, the less justice you get. In fact, sometimes they use the law and the letter of it to get you to justice, right? So he gives an example of more law, less justice. Through such interpretation, also a great deal of wrong is committed in transactions between state and state. Thus, when a truce had been made with the enemy for 30 days, a famous general went to ravaging their fields by night, because he said the truce stipulated days, not nights. Now that is swindling, not arbitration, and therefore such sharp practice is under all circumstances to be avoided. Now, to be clear, it's not like Roman law and Greek law beforehand. It's not like they got rid of all their loopholes. They didn't. But rhetorically speaking, they actually talked a lot about how the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, or the way they put it, the words of the law and the intention of the law can often conflict with each other, and that they always want to preserve the intention of the law over the letter of the law. And moreover, if they see that there's a problem with what's going to happen if we apply the law now, what they'll do is they'll just change the law. That's what they'll do. Now, it's in that environment that Chazal basically said, sorry, we don't really believe in this dichotomy between letter of the law and spirit of the law. And we certainly don't think that one is better than the other. They actually both matter a great deal. And so that's what we're going to see in the way that Chazal deal with this issue of what makes a legal loophole religious, okay? I want to pause here and just see if there are any questions or comments. And you can just throw them in the chat. You can unmute yourself. We're 16 people. It's all good. And if there aren't, don't worry about it either. Okay, it's lunchtime. Do your thing. Okay. Elana, go for it.
Okay, my question is in terms of loopholes,
Mhm.
and this is back to the halakhic. Do the loopholes have to equally apply to everybody, or it's like basically I feel like there is something interesting when the loophole benefits some and totally excludes others? And then, of course,
So
there's
I
a
think
question
that's a
over
great
who is making
question.
loopholes.
Right. So you actually have you have three questions, right? One question is who gets to decide? Another question is what happens if a loophole benefits some people and doesn't benefit others, or maybe even hurts others? And a third is, do you apply loopholes across the board? So for example, if I'm allowed to do a loophole of selling my chametz, does that mean you're also allowed to do a loophole of selling your chametz? So what I want you to do is I want you to hold on to those questions because I don't think we're yet in the position to answer them, but hold on to those questions and maybe even throw them in the chat so that we save the chat and we can look at it later. I saw Robert's hand next and then Emily. Yes.
Thanks. I just
Robert,
wanted to
what do
be,
you got?
yeah, I just wanted to be sure. Did I hear you right that Chazal, Jewish legal tradition, doesn't acknowledge that there are any never, or considers that there are never conflicts between the intention or spirit, we might say, and letter of the law? Did I hear that correctly?
So no, meaning what I was trying to say, and maybe I should say it more clearly, is they reject the choice that you have to choose one or the other. They will try their best to show that sometimes the letter is actually what can get you to the intention rather than being some like non-essential husk of the law, right? The way that the Greeks and the Romans thought about it was the law is just the intention. And the letter is sort of the non-essential way that the law is generally applied. For Chazal, that was not the case. They gave a lot of credence to the letter of the law, as we can see, not even just in loopholing contexts. Think to yourself about the difference between doing something on Shabbat that is a biblical prohibition and doing it with a shinui, changing the way you do it, making it a rabbinic prohibition. Why should the way that I do something matter, right? For Chazal, actually, form matters a lot. You might even say that when we think about philosophy, sometimes we think about philosophy in terms of what the consequences are going to be. And sometimes we think about moral philosophy in terms of how you get to those consequences, right? So, for example, is there a difference between whether I actively take some machine that's helping a person in a vegetative state breathe? If I actively remove it, there is a moral difference between that and if we have to clean the machine and we take the machine out every umpteen number of days, and then I put the machine in someone who has a chance to live and get better, is there a moral difference between the two? So if you're a consequentialist, if you're a consequence-oriented person, you would say, that's not what the question is at all. The question is, who do you think can possibly live? And whether you do it actively or do it passively, doesn't matter. Whereas the deontologist, someone who cares about the way you get there, will say, actually, the way you do it matters, right? So there's a lot here, and I think we're going to continue to see it as we unfurl this whole rabbinic conversation. But it's a great question, and I'm glad you asked for clarification on that. Emily, did you want to
Thank
say
you.
something?
Thank you. Can
Of
I
course,
just
Robert.
add, thank you for the extended answer. I
For sure.
found it puzzling the way I took what I took you to mean and
Yeah.
appreciate the subtlety. I still am
Oh, of course.
lazy about it,
But
but the subtlety is very valuable. You also, I missed
thanks.
a word, no doubt out of ignorance. You said what if you act on the basis of a difference between violating a biblical prohibition and doing that action with a something that had to do with
A
rabbinic.
shinoi, a change in the way you do it. You do it with a different hand, you do it with your
Ah.
elbow, whatever it is, you do it in a way that makes
Okay.
it not the regular way, which you're sort of like, well, what do you mean? The end result is the same. What's the difference? For Chazal, there's a big difference, right? Great. Emily.
Thanks very much.
Of course,
And
Robert, my pleasure.
as a writer and editor, I appreciate the word consequentialist, which I'm not sure I've ever heard before.
Yes,
Anyway,
it's a
thank
big
you.
one. It's very important. Okay, Emily, what do you got? Great to see you. You're muted.
Apropos Robert's comment just now, I also missed the word, what was the contrasting word to consequentialist?
Deontology,
Oh,
right? Deontology, because deontology refers to a law. It's the way you get there. What are you allowed to do or not allowed to do? As opposed to what consequence are you trying to get to? Now, I don't want to confuse us, but there is something that's like a third way, which is called virtue ethics, which is what kind of person do you want to be? Which also you could find that in both of these, to be honest. Like, so we'll see where it goes again as we continue to unfurl. Yeah,
but
Emily.
also, I think your response to Robert helped me with this, is that, in other words, the rabbinic approach goes deeper than just saying that the rabbis had extreme loyalty to the original law, and that's why they had to hold on,
Correct.
create ways to hold on to it even when it wasn't working. So you're saying there's more to that in terms of how you get to,
There's a different philosophy of law.
yeah.
It's a different philosophy of law. Like, I'll give another example that shows up in the 19th century. Okay. In the 19th century, there's a school that's called the historical school of legal philosophy. And the historical school of legal
in general,
in secular, it's German, actually. The historical school of secular philosophy, of legal philosophy, excuse me, basically looked at law and said, wait a second, you can't just say that you can change things whenever you want, because the law as it has arrived is a representation of the spirit of the people. And so the externals of the law matter a lot. Now, that was not coming from people who considered the law to be divinely given. That was coming from people who essentially said, we think form matters and we think it expresses something. There was also part of the logic within the historical school seemed to be that, if you want a legal system to persist, changing it every time it leads you to consequences that you don't want is not a great way to make that happen, right? So that could be part of it also. And I think it also could be that I think for Chazal, when they looked at the law, they really believed that it was divine, meaning that even its form and format was significant. It mattered. And it wasn't just like a nod and a wink. It really mattered, right? Like when you say a person's wearing clothing, right? If clothing matters, the law is the clothing of the intention. That clothing is not nothing, right? It's not nothing, it's something, right? But we'll see more as we continue to go. But I'm really glad that we're like getting in some ways to the heart, right? And that's why I love that picture with the heart and the loopholes, because it's essentially saying the only way to maintain this system is to appreciate that sometimes the letter can actually help you get to the heart of the matter. But we'll get there. Let's take a look at where Chazal have what I think is their most important foundational conversation about when is a loophole okay and when is it not. And what it shows you is that what they are doing when they talk loopholes, they're not doing plain old legal formalism that whatever formally passes muster works. They are trying to refract their values, the values that they believe that either halakha already contains or that halakha should care about. Always hard to figure out exactly where these values come from, to Elana's question, right? But they want to show that it's when the values are actualized, that's when the loopholes are allowed. But when they're not allowed. And in fact, the word that I keep coming back to is the word integrity. When Chazal found that a loophole has integrity, they said, go for it. When a loophole did not have integrity, they said, no way. Now, what is integrity? And we're about to look at a Gemara that's hard. So I'm actually giving you a little bit of I want to give you the primer first. They're going to look, this is a Talmud Yerushalmi, right? Edited, probably late 4th century or early 5th century Common Era. The Talmud Yerushalmi takes two earlier examples of ha'aramot, of loopholes, in which the same two rabbis are arguing. But it's amazing. In scenario one rabbi says yes to the loophole, and the other says no. And in scenario 2, they flip their positions. It's perfect, because now we have an opportunity to say, what makes Rabbi Yeshua want a loophole here and not want a loophole there? What makes Rabbi Eliezer not want a loophole here and yes, want a loophole there? It helps us understand how do they build their parameters? What's integrity, right? What's integrity? And what's going to end up happening is we're going to see two different versions of integrity. What I like to call goal integrity, like does the matara, does the goal that you're going for, does it have integrity? Meaning, does halakha recognize it as something that matters? And process integrity. You might have the best goals, but the process also has to be something that doesn't undermine Jewish law. Okay, so even if you have the best goals, if the process is something that undermines Jewish law, we're going to have a no-go. Now, this, I think, is very important because it really is the DNA of arguments that happen even today, right? Where are you more about the integrity of the goal, or are you more about the integrity of the process, or what it does to the network of halakha, to the system of halakha, if you try to get around it, right? Like, I just want you to imagine in aguna conversations, chas v'shalom, in aguna conversations, you might have poskim, you might have decisors who are arguing. Some say, well, the goal is it's so lofty. You want to prevent a woman from getting stuck. You want to prevent, God forbid, mamzerim from being born, right? You want to prevent illegitimate children from being born. You even want to prevent this person from maybe, God forbid, violating Jewish law and sleeping with somebody because she's stuck as an aguna for 10 years, right? These are lofty, lofty, lofty goals. And there are people who will turn around on the other side and say, yes, but what are we worried about? We're worried about using loophole X because it's not going to work well for the system. Meaning the system is going to be undermined. Kiddushin and Gittin, marriage laws are going to be undermined, right? Now, by the way, you can have the flip side. You can have those same people will say, actually, I have a very lofty goal also. I can't use this loophole because I'm worried that this loophole actually doesn't free the aguna. And if she chooses to sleep with someone else or marry someone else, or her children will be, God forbid, mamzerim, and she will be in violation of Jewish law, right? And then the other people say, yeah, well, if you don't find a solution to the aguna cases, I got to tell you, the whole process of Jewish law, the whole system of Jewish law is going to be undermined, right? So when we talk about integrity of process and integrity of goal, these things are talked about all the time, let alone when they're both talking about integrity of process and they're both talking about integrity of goal, but they each have different goals in mind, or they each have different processes in mind, right? By the way, I just want to say, because I always I'm trying to be analytical about these things, but I do think it's very important just in terms of standing with agunot. I think it's important to say that if you're on the side of we're worried about what's going to happen to the system, I would say you're not going to end up being able to solve every aguna case. You just aren't. But that says to me, instead of focusing just on cases post facto, are you focusing on prevention? Because if you can't find a way out of every aguna case, you have to be able to do something that's going to prevent it from coming to the fore, as opposed to those who are going to be more makil, who are going to be more, what's the word that I'm looking for, lenient in terms of individual cases, right? It's a little bit of a different story. So I want to put that out there because I do think it's very important. So let's go to our example from the Yerushalmi. Yerushalmi is going to take two examples. One example is from Pesach, and I want to talk about it. It goes like this. I was foolish enough to think that I could bake matzah on Yom Tov, on Pesach. This is a very bad idea. It's a very bad idea for a number of reasons. One is, I mean, what happens if the dough rises? I don't do it fast enough, right? There's a lot of reasons why it's not a great idea. But let's imagine I don't have, an easy way to preserve different things, so I do it on Yom Tov. So we have a little bit of a problem because it turns out that I've made enough dough that I have to separate the portion for the Kohen, the challah, okay? Which is fine, right? Back in the day, so okay, find a Kohen, give it to them, or by the way, bake it, give it to the Kohen to eat. It's Yom Tov. You can bake on Yom Tov. What's the problem? Okay, so we have like one added problem. Either the dough at some point became tameh. It became ritually impure. So now no Kohen's going to eat it. We'd have to do, even in ancient times, what we do today, which is we just burn it, right? You burn it in the oven. So here's my problem. I'm making matzah, amazing, fantastic, and I have to separate some of the dough. Now, I certainly can't put this dough in the oven because I'm not allowed to just put something into the oven and burn it on Yom Tov. You're only allowed to put something in the oven on Yom Tov if you're going to eat it that day. Nobody's going to eat it. It's ritually impure. It's tameh. I don't want to leave it on the counter because then it's going to rise and I'm going to have chametz on Pesach that I own on my counter. So I have a little bit of a problem. I'm a little bit stuck. So what am I supposed to do? I'm curious if anybody has any good ideas. What would you do? Think about it to yourself and let's take a look at what the Mishnah gives us, okay? Now, this is a little confusing because the Talmud Yerushalmi, it has the Mishnah, like in our versions, our printed versions, we have the Mishnah printed with it. But actually, the Talmud Yerushalmi is very often not based on the Mishnah's versions of things, but based on the Tosefta's versions of things. And that's actually going to become an issue, as you'll see in a minute. So Mishnah goes like this. Ketzad mafrishin challah tuma b'yom tov. How am I supposed to take challah, meaning the portion that's supposed to go to the Kohen, if it is tameh, impure, on the holiday? And trust me, it's the holiday of Pesach. We are in Masechet Pesachim, tractate Passover, okay? So what am I supposed to do? Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rabbi Eliezer says, I've got a loophole for you. I've got a harama for you. Don't worry about it. Al tikra lashem ad shetefeh. Do not call it challah until it's already baked. Meaning, sounds like I put all the dough in. And once the dough is in there, I say, oh, that little piece over there, that's challah dough, and I leave it there. So great, when I put it in, I have plausible deniability that any particular piece is challah and is going to be burned. I could suggest, no, well, actually, this I'm going to eat, and this I'm going to eat, this I'm going to eat. Okay, but you might be thinking to yourself, okay, but something in there is going to be challah, and you put the whole thing in, and some of it is going to stay there to be burned. But that's Rabbi Eliezer's loophole for you. Ben Betera is a chemist. Ben Betera omer tatil etzonim. What do you mean? There's a way to keep this dough from rising. You don't have to put it in the oven. Just put it in cold water. That'll keep it from rising. The same way if you put dough in a freezer, it's not going to rise. What's the problem, right? And then Rabbi Yoshua, and this is where it gets a little confusing, Rabbi Yoshua says, Amar Rabbi Yoshua, lo zehu chametz shemus harim alav bal yireh bal yimatzeh. He says, I'm actually worried about this dough that grows on your table. I'm not really worried. I don't think you actually violate ownership of chametz through owning challah dough. Why? Maybe because the prohibition is to own your own chametz, but maybe challah dough is not yours. It's God's in some way. It's something that you give to a kohen. Maybe that's why. Ela mafrashta umanachta ad ha'erev. Rather, you just take off the dough, you put it on your counter until the evening. And if you become a chametz, so be it, not a problem. It's fine, right? Now, here's what's confusing. It sounds like here Rabbi Eliezer says, here's a loophole for you. Don't call it chametz till it's already in the oven. It sounds like Ben Betera says, I'm going to solve your problem a different way. Just use chemistry, keep it cold, and it won't rise. And it sounds like Rabbi Yeshua says, I don't have a problem with it rising because it's not really yours. It really belongs lagavoha, we would say, to the on high, to God. Okay? But I'll tell you something. In the Tosefta, Rabbi Yeshua doesn't say that. Rabbi Yeshua says, you know what? I'd rather you violate by just leaving the dough on your counter and you passively violated than violating actively by putting it in the oven. Right? So it's not that Rabbi Yeshua thinks you don't need a loophole. It's that Rabbi Yehoshua thinks you can't use a loophole. Okay, but let's see with a little more detail what this looks like for Rabbi Eliezer. His
Dr.
loophole.
Hain,
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Would you like me to
No, no.
read out loud the comments and questions from the chat, or will we get to it when we have a little break?
I just want to read one thing from the
No
Gemara,
problem.
and then I want to pause just to
Sounds
make sure
great.
that we get the full idea. Thank you
Perfect.
so much. So, Ketzad Yaseh al Rabbi Eliezer. What should you do based on Rabbi Eliezer? Here's what you should do. Ma'arim ve'omer. You should be prudent and say, that's what I use for when you're allowed to do it. I say be prudent. When you're not allowed to do it, I say be cunning. You should be prudent and say, Zo ani rotze lochal. I want to eat this piece of dough today on Yom Tov. V'zo ani rotze lechol. I want to eat this piece of dough. Ve'ofet kola. And you bake it all. Ukeshehu rodeh. And when you're taking it out, ma'arim ve'omer. I'm going to again be prudent and say, Zo ani rotza liyashen. Actually, this piece of dough, I'm not going to eat for today, because think about the amount of dough that I made. I can't possibly eat all of it today, right? I'm going to put some of it aside. Zo ani rotza liyashen. I'm going to put this part aside also. And eventually, mishayer achat, I leave one piece that's just in the oven. There it is, and it gets burnt up. Amazing. There's your loophole. Now let's look for a minute at some of the questions to make sure that it's very clear, okay? So somebody says, can I pour something disgusting on the challah so that it's no longer food? I, by the way, think, Miriam, we can come up with a lot of loopholes here, right? We could try to do something that turns it into totally inedible, even for a dog. We could try to make the amount of dough that wouldn't require us to set apart challah to begin with, right? Like, there are a lot of ways we could avoid this. I think this Mishnah is here to test the case, right? Meaning that's the point of the Mishnah. It's not because this is the only way it can be done, but it's because this actually shows you three different principles, right? One principle that says go for the loophole, another principle that says actually there's a different way to do this, and a third principle, which according to the Tosefta is be passive rather than active, or according to the Mishnah is you don't even need a loophole because you should know that this belongs to God and doesn't belong to you, right? So I think that's a great question. The question of at which point is it no longer yours? Great question, right? Like it's no longer mine, I think, once I call it challah, right? I think that's what happens. And remember, at that point, it hasn't risen yet, right? Once I designate it, now this is lagavoha, this belongs to God, so to speak, and it's not mine, right? These are great, great, great questions. So by the way, Rabbi Eliezer's loophole, I just want you to think about it for a minute. Could you see yourself using that loophole? Just like think in your head. Because I'll tell you something, if anybody has ever, warmed up food on Yom Tif because they want to take a piece of it before Shabbos starts, right? Now, we do an Erev Tavshilin, so it doesn't matter. But there are times when you actually do use something like this, right? Like, okay, I'll eat a little of it, I'll take a little of it. So here it's the reverse, right? Okay, I thought that the loophole for cooking on Yom Tov is so that we eat it on Yom Tov. Now, let's make clear, that's not even a loophole. It's right in the Torah. The Torah says, right, only what's going to be eaten that day can you actually cook, right? So, Carolyn, you should be confused because basically, if we burn it, didn't we just violate the prohibition of cooking by retroactively, right? By retroactively undoing, well, I don't know if you're talking about my example of Erev Tavshilin or you're talking about the example in the Gemara, but certainly what Rabbi Eliezer just allowed you to do is he allowed you to burn a piece of dough on Yom Tov. But he did it in such a way that because it wasn't clear that that wasn't something you were going to be allowed to eat, because you haven't named it as such yet, when you put it in, it's a possibility, right? You might be familiar, some people might be familiar with a Gemara that is actually very similar to this, but goes in a slightly different direction, which is it talks about how much you can cook on Yom Tov. And the discussion of, well, because guests might come over, even if you can't eat all this yourself, you can cook more, right? So what is that, right? It's a plausibility structure. What Rabbi Eliezer has allowed you to do here is create a plausibility structure. It is plausible that I might eat each of these pieces when I look at them individually. even if as a whole there's one of them that I'm not going to eat. So Carolyn, that's what's so radical about what Rabbi Eliezer is allowing. Is that clear? And you don't have to answer, but if you want to
Yes.
answer, you totally can. Okay, great. I love that you're just sort of like, hey, I'm slack-jawed. Like, how do you allow you to do that, right? So what about all the cases when Chazal tell us not to do an action with ha'arama? Good. So I want to look at the second example that the Gemara is about to give, because the Gemara is going to say, hey, wait a second. I've seen Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua argue about ha'arama before. There's a different case where they switch sides on this, where it's not Rabbi Eliezer who's allowing you to do the harama, it's Rabbi Yoshua. And here's the case. And this is what I think is so like fun and sometimes weird about trying to get to the legal logic. You actually have to climb the hill of the technical details. Like that's just, you have to do it in order to see the beautiful scenery at the top of the summit. So you got to climb with me here, okay? It goes like this. Let's say I own animals. My animal on Yom Tiv, my animals, I'm talking about like a steer. My animals on Yom Tiv are muktzah. I'm not allowed to move them unless I'm going to shech them and eat them, right? That's it. They're muktzah. There's no use for them. There's no Yom Tov use for them. What if my animal fell into a pit on Yom Tov? Now, being in a pit on Yom Tov, that's not very safe, meaning it's exposed to the elements, exposed to predators. Who knows what could happen there, right? Can I take it out? Can I pull it out or not, right? So directly speaking, I shouldn't pull it out. But if I'm pulling it out, in a way that's going to, I don't know, make it look like I'm pulling it out to slaughter it. Maybe, right? Or maybe just I actually am pulling it out to slaughter it and eat at least some of it on Yom Tov itself. Okay? Now imagine that instead of having one animal in the pit on Yom Tov, I have two. And it's a mommy-baby pair. So now I have a real problem. Mother-child pair of animals, I'm not allowed to slaughter both of them in the same day. Torah says it straight out. You cannot slaughter an animal and its child. And Chazal explained that as a female animal and her child. Can't do it. So how am I going to get these animals out of the pit? Maybe I can only get one animal out of the pit. So guess what? In this case, Rabbi Eliezer basically says, yeah, you can only get one animal out of the pit. You're going to take one out to shecht it. You're going to slaughter it. You're going to eat it, or at least part of it. And the other one, you're going to leave in the pit, and you're going to try to do what you can to take care of it until Yom Tov ends. And Rabbi Yeshua says, no. I have a really good loophole for you. Wait, the same Rabbi Yeshua who said no to the loophole with chametz? Well, let's take a look, okay? Look at what he says. So the Gemara says, well, let's take the example of what we just said. Otov et beno shenaflu labor, a mother and its child, animals that fell into a pit on Yom Tov. Rabbi Eliezer says, Ya'alet harishon al manat lishchot, you should take out the first one in order to slaughter it. V'yishchot, and slaughter it. V'hasheni, and the second one, osin lo parnasa shelo yamut. Do what you can to keep it safe so that it won't die during the holiday. Rabbi Yoshua, on the other hand, has a great move. Rabbi Yoshua omer, Ya'alet harishon al manat lishchot, v'lo yishchot. Nope. Take out the first one in order to slaughter it, but then don't slaughter it. Meaning, take it out and say, I don't know, looks scrawny, I'm not interested. Right? Plausibility. It was plausible that I could slaughter it and eat it, but I really want to. And then, v'ya'arim, then be prudent. V'ya'alet hasheni, take out the second one. And guess what? Even though you never plan to slaughter either of them, it's fine. Oh, what? Amazing, right? He says you're basically performing an intention, right? You're performing plausibility. Why would Rabbi Yoshua? I mean, it's literally the same concept, isn't it? Rabbi Eliezer says you're performing a plausibility with this dough on chametz, like on Pesach. I might eat it, right? So I'm going to put it in the oven. And Rabbi Yoshua there says no, at least in the Tosefta, be passive, don't be active. And here Rabbi Yoshua says, no, perform a plausibility, no problem. I might eat it, so I'm taking it out. I might eat the other one, so I'm taking it out. And then you don't even have to eat either of them. You don't even have to shech either of them, right? And Rabbi Eliezer, he won't go there. So why in one does Rabbi Eliezer go there and in the other one he won't? In one, Rabbi Yeshua won't go there and in the other one he will. Well, what's going on? So it's the perfect opportunity to ask ourselves what makes for religious loopholing, okay? Rabbi Bon bar Chia, so Rabbi Bon, the son of Chia, asks, Mechlef ashitatei Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer seems to have a self-contradictory perspective. Taman hu amar asur laharim. With the animals, it seems like he's not allowing you to loophole. V'hacha hu amar mutar laharim. But with the dough on Pesach, he is allowing it. So what's his reasoning? So the Gemara says it's very clear. His reasoning is about the goal. Hacha, here in the case of matzah, because remember we're in tractate Passover, here in the case of the dough with the matzah, mishum bal yireh bal yimetzeh. We're trying to keep you from violating Jewish law. We don't want you to own chametz on Pesach. We can't let you leave it on the counter. And that's why he's willing to give you a loophole, because he's trying to keep you from transgressing. Now, you might say to me, well, doesn't he think you're transgressing by putting something in the oven? The answer is no, he doesn't. He really doesn't. The plausibility is all you need, right? So in order to save someone from sin, you can allow a loophole. But taman, but over there, in the case of the animals, might eat lach. What's the reasoning? What's a goal? What's the integrity of the goal that would allow it? Now, I know some of you are thinking, what do you mean, what's the integrity of the goal? Don't we say it's a problem to let animals suffer? First of all, I don't even know if that's anywhere in the Jerusalem Talmud. It's in the Babylonian Talmud, but I don't even know if it shows up in the Jerusalem Talmud. I've done a search for it, but it might have different language. But our concept of tsar ba'alei chayim, pain to animals, doesn't show up as such in the Jerusalem Talmud. Again, it might show up in different language, but second, when you look at the Babylonian Talmud, it actually does mention that the reason why Rabbi Yeshua allows it here is because of the pain to the animals. Third, there's a conversation, there's a machloket, there's an argument over whether causing pain to animals is a biblical violation or a rabbinic violation. So if you think it is a violation, but it's a rabbinic violation, which is the worst violation, violating only chametz Pesach, which is a biblical violation, or violating the pain to an animal, which is a rabbinic violation, right? There's all of these things. But the point here is, what's the integrity about for Rabbi Eliezer? He's willing to allow it when you have a reason that the halacha itself would sanction, like keeping people from sin. You're stuck between a rock and a hard place, and that rock and a hard place is not your wallet and the halacha, it's the halacha and the halacha. And we want to keep people from violating the halacha, right? So that's the first type of integrity. Carolyn, can we wait 1 minute until I go to Rabbi Yoshua? Because it's going to give us a little bit more. Is that okay? Thank you. Appreciate you. Then the Gemara says, Mechlef ashitatei Rabbi Yoshua. I don't understand Rabbi Yoshua. Tamanu amar mutar laharim. In the animal's case, why is he allowing you to do such, by the way, I'm going to add such a radical ha'arama? V'hachu amar asur laharim. And here in the case of the Pesach baking episode, he won't allow it. Amar Rav Idi says, well, let me tell you, it's actually about integrity of process. Rav Idi says, kan shivut, when it comes to handling animals on Shabbat, on Yom Tov, excuse me, that is not a biblically explicit commandment that you can't handle animals on Shabbat or on Yom Tov. It's not explicit in the Bible. And so it's actually a lesser violation. But putting something in the oven, like Carolyn said, on Yom Tov and just burning it, that is a biblical violation. So meaning, for Rabbi Yoshua, he says, look, it's not just about having good goals. I understand that you have good goals, but the process has to have integrity. If you're telling me that you're going to allow somebody to circumvent a biblically explicit law, like not cooking something on Yom Tov that you're not going to eat, no way, says Rabbi Yoshua. You want to get around something that we would call an Isser Shvut, we might call today a rabbinic prohibition, fine, but not a biblical prohibition, right? That's a different kind of integrity. That's not just integrity about what's your goal. That's integrity about what's the process and what is it going to do to the system for you to be able to do this. And then they come up with another goal-oriented distinction. Rabbi Yossi be Rabbi Bon, Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rav Avin, says, Taman kidei lechus al nechseon shel Yisrael. Actually, in the animal case, what makes it so compelling for Rabbi Yoshua is he really thinks what we're doing is we're protecting the wallet, because you don't want to lose both of your animals. That's an incredible expense. And protecting the wallet, I would say for Rabbi Yoshua, is just as important as not violating owning chametz, right? On Pesach. Protecting the wallet he sees as a Jewish value. So what's interesting is between these three, you have an integrity of Jewish goals. And is the goal, for the goal to have integrity, does it have to be something as legalistic as we're keeping people from violating the Torah? Or can it even be something that's like a value of the law, that we want to protect Jewish money, right? We don't want people to go bankrupt keeping halakha, which, by the way, you might say, oh, is that a value of the law itself? I will tell you, yes, it is a value of the law itself, 100%. So a Mishnah in Negaim, chapter 12, conversation of why is it before we call a house sarua, before we say that a house has the kind of scale disease that requires for anything in the house to become tameh and requires for you to knock down the house, right? Why is it that before we pronounce a house tameh, which would make everything in it tameh also, why do we remove everything from the house so that it doesn't become tameh? What's the big deal? So let things become tameh. It'll just purify them. Well, there's one substance that can't be purified: pottery. If it becomes tameh, it has to be broken. Okay, but pottery is so cheap. Who cares? The Torah cares. The Torah cares. And then the Mishnah there says, it's amazing. It says, if the Torah cares about this little silly nothing money, what do you think the Torah cares about how much do you think the Torah cares when we're talking about bigger things? If the Torah cares about money this much, how much do you think the Torah cares about people even more, right? So lest you think that that's not a Jewish goal, it is a Jewish goal. But then there's a different kind of integrity, which is integrity of process. And maybe it's possible that there are some laws that cannot be circumvented. And here it's suggested that explicit biblical laws cannot be circumvented, while non-explicit, or what we might call today, there's a little bit of an evolution of this concept, rabbinic laws can be circumvented. Two different types of integrity. Okay, Carolyn says, but why not just say you can slaughter the animal because guests might show up? So first of all, you still can't slaughter both, right? Even if you can slaughter one.
Right, not both, but then it seems to me Rabbi Eliezer's answer would be sufficient. But I think that Rabbi Yossi ben Rabbi Bun actually came and answered my question, and that the real issue is the money.
Right. And I think when you get to the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, which is what we're going to do next time, you actually see this whole conversation about process becomes much more important. Like in the early material, the goal seems to be mostly everything, except in a comment like this, right? But when you get to the Bavli, process becomes much more important, okay? And we'll see it. Great. Okay, comments or questions at this time. And no question is too basic or too profound. They're all welcome. They're all wonderful. Okay, so here, oh yes, Elana, please.
So again, maybe
Please.
I'm just not clear on this, but it's basically if we can find whatever is the bigger overarching theme, which is driving the decision making, it's basically like we can frown upon loopholes, but because there is a bigger overarching something, we're going to allow it. And I'm thinking about
Yes.
Yom Tov because it's like people have to eat, so therefore we don't like certain
great.
things, but yet we're going to allow you to do this.
Amazing. So the way that I think about this is if you wanted to put this in terms of intention and letter of the law, right? What I would say is, yeah, I get it. The intention of this law is not to let you burn your chametz, but the intention of the legal system as a whole is it doesn't want you to have to violate halakha when you're trying to keep halakha, right? So if you wanted to put it in terms of intention and wording, I think you could do that by saying it's not just about the local intention of a local law, it's about the intention of the system as a whole, right? Like the system as a whole has values. And I think I don't love putting it as intention versus wording, because then I think it stuffs it into a Greco-Roman lens, which I don't like. But I think that, not that I don't like the lens, it's I don't like trying to stuff one type of legal philosophy into another because they actually disagree fundamentally. But I do think that for Chazal, there are overarching values that the Torah legal system cares about. Again, where do those values come from? Like, if I'm reading those values in the 21st century, would I read them differently than someone reading in the 5th century? Barur, of course. Both because issues change, right? Like what we consider value laden changes, and because I just might read words differently. I might read context differently. There's so many reasons, right? Cultural, there's so many reasons, right? And so one of the things, it's very interesting because I find that one of the things that I think about, and this is to Robert's question in the chat, one of the things I think about is we live today, I mean, I'm living in Israel for the year. So you would say that it's not the same because there's a rabbanut here, but there's still plenty of places where what you're doing is you're living in local communities of interpretation, right? Living in your region. I mean, forget it. You could have Jews overlapping. They live on, the same block and they live in different communities of interpretation. And I do think it's interesting to ask, in my community of interpretation, what goals have integrity, right? I think those goals, like naming integrity differs by community, I think. And I also think it's a question of, in my community, what process has integrity. I think that's a little more slippery. Because it's slippier. I think that's a little more slippery, but I think when we see the Bavli next week or in 2 weeks, we're going to see it's kind of interesting because you start to see them defining what integrity of process looks like a little differently than what we see here, or in fact, very differently from what we see here. But suffice it to say, what at least this has given us is I think it's given us an appreciation that for Chazal, this is not just some like, it's not facile. I'm going to put it that way. It's not facile. Trying to determine what has integrity is no small question. And look, I'll tell you the examples that I didn't give you. Exploiting people. Over and over again, Chazal say no to ha'arama that's taking advantage of a third party, right? Most of the ha'arama that comes up is ha'arama ben adam lamakom, between human beings and God, which to me makes the rabbis out to be lawyers for the Jewish people, right? Meaning God is the judge, the rabbis are their lawyers, and we're their clients. So the lawyers are not looking to undermine all of law, but they are looking to make sure that their client has the best that they can. That is so different from the rhetoric, the Greco-Roman rhetoric, which sounds so much more like judges saying, I want to stamp out this loophole, right? So there's an interesting, people have the sources, and I would totally encourage you to look, because I included 2 beautiful, beautiful midrashim about God and loopholing. Now, one of them, the Shmot Rabbah, is from after our window, right? It's an Agadic midrash. It's a homiletical midrash. It's from after our window. But the Breshit Rabbah is from within our window. It's a, 4th century common era, I think, or I don't know if they're saying 4th century now or 5th century now. I'm not sure. Early 5th century. But suffice it to say, it's within our window. But take a look also, and with this I'll end, at what my friend, Rabbi Dr. Richard Hidary says in his book. He says, it's so weird. You look at Chazal and they really don't like lawyers, right? We don't have a court system. Our Beit Din is not, doesn't have lawyers, right? That's not the way we do it, right? But in Shamayim, in Beit Din Shel Mala, in the court of heaven, there are a lot of lawyers in rabbinic literature. And it's kind of brilliant. It's sort of like, well, God wants us to win, so God allows us to lawyer, right? So there's a lot here in terms of values and maybe even theology, right? Of what the purpose of law is and how to keep the relationship between God, the legal system, and practicing Jews and communities. To be continued in 2 weeks. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Is it okay if I ask a question, or do you need to jump off?
I'm happy to stay, but I know that other people probably have to jump off because it's been an hour. So I want to respect that. But Vakasha, yeah, please.
That feels valid. My question is just, it feels like you can get, I don't mean to be overly reductive, but, if all you have to do is fake an intention, as long as your intentions, your real intentions are good, I just want to make sure I'm protecting my wallet. I want to make sure I'm protecting my animal. I want to make sure I'm, protecting whatever it is that, whatever your value is. it feels a little loose.
Great. Great. So two things. One, it's going to go back to Elana's question about who has the authority to do this, and we'll keep talking about it. But two, I want you to see the Bavli doesn't want it to be that loose. And the Babylonian Talmud is going to start limiting a little bit more. And I think for that reason, right? It's a little too open, right? Appreciate that a lot. All right, my
And then
friends, to be continued. Thank you so much. Have a great day. For me, good night. For everybody else, have a great day. Bye.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hain, and thank you everyone who joined us today. Just a reminder that we will not meet next week. Class will resume the following week, March 31st. I also put information for Dr. Hain's book in the chat several times if you're interested. In terms of other classes, we have many that are still happening this spring's month. You can find classes and register on jerisha.org/classes. Lehitraot. Thank you.
Bye, friends. Thank you.